All right, well, hello everyone. Thank you for coming to Homework. Welcome. We're going to be having a panel discussion about the experiential and event-driven culture dominating today's art world. My name is Aurelio Aguilo. I'm the co-founder of Homework, which was founded as a response to the event-driven culture of the art world. We're a nomadic art gallery that follows the specific rhythm that the art market has, and we've been in and around the art market for about a decade, and we saw how dependent all sectors of the art world were to this specific rhythm, and how the barriers of entry were sometimes very hard to break. So we wanted to create a platform where we would be able to show artists, emerging artists that we like, that haven't had the opportunity to show during these critical times. But also we wanted to cater to the art consumer, which makes up a huge part of the art world, but they sometimes, or most of the time, feel priced out by the exorbitant prices of these shows and these events. And I'm very thankful for my guests tonight, Andrew McLees, Senior Marketing Manager of the ICA.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate the invite, and I'm excited to share a little bit of knowledge.
Well, thank you for coming. Well, just a brief intro. The contemporary art world is a money-making behemoth. Millions of dollars are being moved in and around art-related enterprises each year. Blue-chip galleries report millions of dollars in sales, while auction houses report billions. Museum and nonprofit organizations' attendance has been going up like crazy in the past decade. And right now we're seeing a massive proliferation of immersive art exhibitions, even traveling art exhibitions, like the Van Gogh, a lot of them by dead artists. There was a time in Miami when there was 2 Van Gogh shows going at the same time. And at one point there was 3 Van Goghs in the country, 3 companies doing Van Gogh shows. And I think most of you guys know the Super Blue right next to the Bell Museum. A lot of money is being spent producing events where a lot of cash is made. The art world and its markets has not stopped growing since the 16th century. However, this phenomenon has transformed the art world calendar and increased the number of events exponentially. Today, this has spread to international markets. Globalization is changing the way art is produced, exhibited, studied, and ultimately consumed. All levels of the art world are important in my opinion, and this phenomenon has an impact on all of them. Today we're going to analyze how this event-driven experiential culture affects the way museums activate their programming, the way galleries operate, how artists produce work, the role of social media in all of this, and ultimately the way all of us consume the art that's being presented. So we're going to start with museums. Different sectors of the art world have been adopting an entertainment-based model. By that I mean that they're staging blockbuster gallery exhibitions where nothing is being sold on the floor, immersive museum exhibitions, must be seen at sponsored events at art institutions. So how is the experiential side of today's art world affecting museums like the ICA in terms of programming, curatorial approaches, marketing, etc.?
Well, first and foremost, thank you so much for having me here. I really appreciate it. ICA since 2014, when we first started, has been, we've been a little bit of we've occupied that space where we've wanted to present the most innovative art of our time and make sure that we're also encouraging, the exchange of art and ideas, and we do so by, exhibitions, public programming, and digital content production. So, to your question, how we've kind of engaged in these spaces are we adopt a little bit more of a traditional discursive museum model insofar that we are very lucky that we have a group of supporters who are willing to foot the bill for making sure that we are able to invest in rigorous research into our exhibitions, public programs, and so on and so forth. And so I think our audiences are a little bit, or at least our programming is a little bit more insulated from the demands, from audience expectations. And that's one thing that we talked about it very briefly, but one thing that I see as a trend in the art market is that with the rise in marketers' influence on the way people understand and consume art is that we're starting to really delve into the psychology of what people expect out of museums. So what I mean by that is that we are beginning to align our mission critical kind of goals and you know, our bottom line with audience expectations, and that really is born from sort of like the marketer's mandate, which is to satisfy the customer at all costs, right? So at the end of the day, the person who comes to the museum, who consumes the art, who experiences the art, and so on and so forth, is the person whose opinion is worth listening to, the person who we value the most, really. That's how a lot of kind of commercial businesses also are sort of predicated. You know, that's you know, Jeff Bezos made a fortune off of prioritizing the customer above all. But at ICA Miami, we've identified those sort of avenues for, you know, what we do best, right? And what we do best is, and I think this is a lesson that all museums can learn, is that you really focus on one or two things versus being everything to everybody. Yeah. So what we are first and foremost is a platform for emerging arts and the exchange of art and ideas, and then second, for the events that spring up around those things. Mm-hmm. So one thing that I've noticed, a trend in the art world specifically, is how these sort of events-driven cultures are really dictating the kinds of art that are being displayed and the kinds of experiences that are being offered. And that is unlike something that maybe a museum of the traditional take would shy away from, right? Yeah. Because historically, you know, there's art world gatekeepers, there's the curators, there's the people who work on the programming side of things. Yeah, who have a lot of the cultural cachet, right? They kind of like own the keys to the castle, and the barriers to entry are large, right? Yes. So there's having a degree, an advanced degree, and so on and so forth, and this has been a trend since the 90s. Yeah. And they're the people with all the power. But since then, this new kind of arts experience economy has blossomed into incorporating more voices, and specifically the consumer's voice, right? So as a marketer, again, all of my focus is on what the customer wants, but also I'm working within a space that is traditionally, you know, a little bit more discursive, more rigorous than what the public is, you know, expecting or wants to consume. And so oftentimes we do kind of like have to take that into account with the way that we present shows and the way that we talk about it and the way we present it on Instagram and via all of those social things. So definitely, that finds its way into our space.
That kind of leads me to my next question, because I was reading that some museums are taking on this immersive art installation culture. Like I was reading that the Louvre had a show, a Mona Lisa show in 2019, where you can see the textures of the painting, how it changed over time. And 2 days ago, I read that they're taking this on the road. They're going to Marseille now with this thing, and I'm just saying, like a museum like that, are the extra costs associated with doing events like this hurting the business, not just financially, because VR is very expensive, but in terms academic, is it hurting it academically in terms of reputation to cater to the masses instead of being academic focused?
That's a good question. So one of the through lines that we can kind of identify here is in how we experience and consume entertainment, right? And we're starting to see this sort of analogous like strain of the things that you might expect from a destination attraction end up in a museum space, and historically that hasn't been the way that it goes. Mm-hmm. So what we're experiencing now is this parallel between the way we consume entertainment and the expectations we project upon cultural institutions. Yeah. A really good example of this is, and you know, Melissa, my partner, and I, we constantly talk about this sometimes, you know, just as sort of like pop cultural detritus, I suppose, but like Emily in Paris, all right? So it's a really great one, right? So it's a really, when I was doing a little bit of reading on the subject, I came across a particular episode where they visit some sort of exhibition and are able to parlay this exhibition into like a successful social media campaign. And it was largely like they're in some sort of like old foundry of sorts, experiencing like artworks up close, but largely mediated by like digital technologies. And it's so funny that like, you know, a company like Netflix is willing to take a chance on a show like this too, because the marketer's mandate, again, we're seeing how it's influencing the way that people go about sharing these experiences, right? And it's all about where you've been, what you see, what you're doing at any given moment. And so I kind of think about that particular instance and that like, that is kind of the way people consume work now. And so the museum's directive is to kind of meet them where they are.
Yeah, which leads me to my next point. Like traditionalists might say that museums offer something of value, that they help promote and move the culture forward. But these experimental or immersive experiences, do you think they do the same, or they just help people participate in culture by having their photo taken in these places, or are they offering something substantial as a way to cater to this new consumer?
Yeah, so I think what we've seen is we've seen sort of like the experience economy playing out in a very nascent way, where we just want to throw a blockbuster event with the opportunity to make a lot of money. And that makes sense for a lot of people who are sort of struggling to, you know, figure out ways of connecting with younger audiences and, you know, of ways of keeping themselves relevant. But on the other hand, we're also seeing a bit of a pushback in the industry in a way that suggests that those experiences were done with absolutely no sensitivity toward the value they were providing the person experiencing them. And what I mean by that is a moment to be educated, or the moment to learn something, or the moment to make connections, which I think is sort of what the entire museum experience is predicated on, right? It's this way of sort of absorbing culture, or being able to, for yourself, walk into a gallery, see an artwork, and really be able to understand it and relate it to either culture at large, or maybe in like a very smaller scale, like the individual, or what you're thinking about on any given day. And what that's been replaced with is this desire to kind of like take that energy and project it outward, which is sharing it via social media, digitally mediated platforms and whatnot. I don't necessarily think that's diluting the product so much as it is creating new opportunities for spreading ideas, but I do question, with a little bit of, you know, coming from the art world, is just once that the ephemerality of that event is gone, what value lives on for the individual if certain boxes aren't ticked, whether it's thinking about art history, how we're creating these connections between what happened then, what happened now, and what's happening in the future, or from various sort of like, how are we absorbing the lessons that this art has to offer, when all we're really concerned about is sharing it amongst our friends?
I think it gets lost. I think it totally gets lost in a way that if all you want to do is take a picture here, you're not really experiencing it. You're not really experiencing it and learning about it. I mean, like, you go to these Van Gogh things and you're not seeing a Van Gogh.
Yeah.
You're seeing a projection.
Yeah.
I even read there was one that you get massages in there. You get there's date packages and stuff like that. Like, it's I don't know.
I wish that was a part of the benefit.
I guess that's what I mean by the participation in culture.
Sure.
It's not really But I guess that's kind of what people have to do in order to stay relevant. I mean, with the government giving less money to public institutions, I mean, you gotta drop people in.
Yeah.
But I mean, these immersive things aren't government funded, so.
Sure. Although, the current administration did inject a healthy amount into the NEA. So there's been a pretty good distribution of those like grant funds too. Yeah. So it's been better for artists, but still, I mean, when we're talking about sort of avenues for funding too, the bottom line also impacts the sort of programming that goes on at the institutional level. I think also, I was talking about the insulation that ICA has as a result of its unique revenue streams, right, which is entirely donor funded, and our ability to kind of parlay that money, that revenue stream into programming that maybe doesn't reach the broadest audience, but what it does is it delivers the absolute best experience to the people who are engaged in that subject. And so we do that through mostly our educational programs. Exhibitions and public programs are always free and that kind of thing. And we have the luxury of being able to do that too. But I acknowledge that there's institutions that need to sort of, I use this term very lightly, compromise the integrity of that programming to be able to extend to these new opportunities, because they very well may have lasting implications on the way people think and consume contemporary art or cultural experiences in general. So I'm wary about sort of introducing that sort of programming into the institutional space, because part of the challenge is really thinking about it as how do we deliver as much value to our audiences as possible. We've identified our audience as being very niche, without diluting the brand, by just like opening it up to everybody and democratizing the process, to the extent that we no longer have control over what happened 60 years ago, which is exactly what art institutions or the more discursive traditional models are concerned with. Canonizing art history to create a narrative that will extend towards new modes of thinking about how art is produced and how we consume it.
Okay. All right. Well, let's move on to the commercial side.
Yeah.
Art galleries make a bulk of their sales at art fairs. As you know, art fairs are popping up all over the world. In Miami, it becomes crazy in December with Art Basel Miami Beach, with millions of satellite fairs popping up, exhibitions like ours. Yet many emerging and mid-level galleries, brick and mortar galleries, traditional galleries, struggle financially when trying to keep up with the rhythm of the art world. So participating in an art world, the overhead is crazy, but you have to participate in order to stay relevant in this world. Do you think this hurts them not only financially, but in terms of their curatorial approaches, if they have to focus so much on being at these places, and also in their relationship with artists?
Yeah. Well, at the commercial level, the gallerist is kind of concerned with the artist the same way that a real estate artist or a real estate realtor might be concerned with a piece of property, and that they want to be able to maximize the utility of the artist to the extent that they'll be able to reap the greatest rewards from them too. A lot of times that is sort of that transactional value, especially at the blue chip level. I find that the relationships that work best are the ones that are a little bit more intimate, where they have a vested interest in the individual and are working very closely with the individual to kind of produce work. The expectation of having to kind of keep up with these events and fairs and whatnot, I can only imagine it's incredibly taxing in that, when you take into account how art and labor, the relationship between art and labor, and what is expected of these artists in order to like be able to compete at that level during art time or art fairs is really stressful for the individual. And I think we touched on this very briefly earlier, but also one of the big things is sort of like what's stopping people from operating within these spaces too. You know, what are the constraints that happen on the daily basis that, you know, are you an artist who has the wherewithal or the pedigree to be able to compete in these spaces, or are you somebody who has to occupy like a 9 to 5? We're seeing sort of like, you know, trends in how people are able to engage or compete in these spaces that are parallel to the acceleration of capitalism. So at the end of the day, that's one thing that we have to take into a concern. And if the event-driven market is what's turning out money, be it an art fair or an immersive experience, then the artists want to, you know, they'd be remiss not to participate. So on one hand, you risk burnout of the artists in their careers by gallerists sort of like, you know, encouraging them to participate in all of these spaces when, you know, they're just human beings. How do they do that? And on the other hand, that is sort of what's expected of them in this new contemporary market.
Yeah, and before the talk, you had mentioned how this kind of happens in all entertainment industries. Like people are burning out all over the place,
right,
in order to keep up with crazy rhythms.
Right, and so the analogy was in artist management, right? Somebody who's compelled to do X, Y, and Z. I guess the phrase would be, you know, you pay your dues before you pay the rent. But now with like digitally mediated platforms, it seems like the inverse is possible more and more these days, and that the expectation is that the artist be everywhere, right? Like, it's in the same way that maybe the image can proliferate across digital mediums, the artist should work just about as hard to have a physical presence in those things. So the manager exploits that, right?
Yeah.
And so we're thinking about that in terms of the mid-career artist who's suddenly charging too much for any mid-tier venue to accommodate, and therefore that person's career is dead in the water, right? Same thing with artists. We're seeing valuations of over $1 million for individual artists at auction these days, when, you know, they've barely broken the age of 40 years old.
Yeah, it kills their market. Definitely.
Well, yeah, you wonder where those artists are going to be when they're 60.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Like, how much more could you expect independent collectors to pay for these artworks?
Yeah.
You know.
And if you stall at that point, you become stuck. Oh, he's stuck.
Right. So what we're seeing is sort of like the expectation for the artist to perform, the tools at their disposal, but also that thing that prevents us from doing just about anything in life, and that is the time and resources to be able to commit, like in a real way, to putting out that information into the universe. And so, platforms like Instagram and social media are making it easier for you to just be able to show your artwork having come right off the rack.
Yeah, still wet.
Yeah, it's still wet, pretty much. Put it onto the artwork and put it onto the internet and start gaining a little bit of traction there before they even have a gallerist. A lot of times that is the gateway from artists becoming, unrepresented to having representation in the art world.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely the go-to platform for artists and social media, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes. But yeah, I mean, Instagram has changed a lot of people's lives in the art world.
Yeah, it really has. The predictive algorithmic machinations of social media have allowed not only artists to kind of like take control of how they distribute their artwork, but also allowing us museum professionals to understand what works and what doesn't. Right?
Yeah. Let's just talk about that because that's actually the next topic. Social media is playing a huge role in altering the landscape in the art world.
Sure.
In terms of communication between galleries, museums, artists, collectors, and ultimately art consumers. I mean, I always find amazing artists randomly on social media.
Yeah.
And Instagram, as I said, is the go-to platform for most people in the art world. But what, other than Instagram, what other programs do you think are altering these communication avenues?
Yeah. So most people who track technology, most futurist thinkers, most people who have kind of like thought about 2001 in a way of what technologies have best impacted, or for better or worse, impacted the way we consume culture, and TikTok's algorithm always comes up. And it's complicated because, on one hand, institutions don't want to be chasing flashes in the pan, right? We don't want to be chasing every social media platform with the understanding that this is going to give us 1,000 new followers or 1,000 new people who wouldn't otherwise have access to the brand. But there is a certain modicum of truth to how people experience and learn about art using the algorithm, right? The algorithm has now become sort of like a shorthand way of explaining how content is delivered to the individual, which satisfies their expectation that is that they will have whatever experience they want to have with whatever cultural institution is willing to dish it out. So in this case, somebody who's interested in contemporary art might have that pop up on their feed almost instantly, right? And organically. Yeah. Like in a way that it almost suggests that it's invasive. It's really somehow been able to like tap into the consciousness of the individual. This is how it feels, and we'll get to how it is in a second. But how it feels is kind of like, wow, every artist I could possibly want to know about is at my disposal now, thanks to TikTok and the algorithm. The reality is that it is a manipulation of how we perceive the arts ecosystem and how we engage, how we consume it, and how we share it. Ultimately, the algorithm is only concerned with engagement. Well, mostly concerned with engagement and how we share, how we comment, how we what we like, right? And that will push whatever it is that you like and what you find most valuable in front of you. So, in the future, any kind of public or any kind of social media platform that is able to absorb the lessons learned from algorithmic, information that's being delivered to us, delivered directly to our inboxes in TikTok, but able to capture like another dimension of the way that we think about contemporary art will be what's next. I see this as being sort of like the torchbearer for how we understand arts these days, but also Instagram, to your point. They both share a lot of the same functions too, and from the marketer's perspective at some place like ICA, we start with that baseline is, what are we creating for Instagram? What are we creating for TikTok? Because they're a little bit interchangeable in the formats and the way that people interact with the algorithm.
Which takes me, we're running a little bit short on time, but I want to talk about two other things. And I think one of the other social media programs that came out last year takes me to the next topic. I mean, Clubhouse. I remember I got on Clubhouse last year, and it was only talking about NFTs.
Sure.
And NFTs, how NFTs are the future of the art world, and that the art world is dead, and traditional art world is dead, and NFTs are what's taken over.
Yes.
And NFTs, yeah, they eliminate the barriers of entry.
Sure.
But in my opinion, I think it's just a medium, because the quality suffers a lot when there's no. I mean, I'm against a lot of the barriers of entries. That's why I started this gallery.
Sure.
But I think quality suffers when everybody can make an NFT, and everybody. I think it's more of a. I don't know how to put this, but yeah, I think it's more of a. I treat them like stocks sometimes.
Sure.
I mean, there's quality NFTs. Barquito Garcia does very good quality NFTs that I would definitely, I'm very interested in. But the environmental consequences of these things are enormous. And I just wanted to get your take on this craziness that started a year ago.
Yeah. So, where do you want to start? You want to start with NFTs, or you want to start on the environmental impact of them?
I mean,
because
we can start wherever, but I also want to save some time to talk about like COVID and the environment.
Yeah, sure. All right, so let's start with NFTs. So with the proliferation of social media and how we share this information, I see there being a direct parallel between the two, which is that for the longest time, again, we go back to gatekeeping and the way that people hoard information, the way people consume information, the way it's distributed, has been appended by this new digital like revolution of sorts. So with Instagram in particular, there's a lot of artists, like an artist in Ohio could have the same sort of cultural cachet as somebody in New York if they have the right number of followers. Let's put this number at 100,000. Let's say some artist is able to operate with 100,000 followers coming out of like some place that wouldn't necessarily be considered an art center, but is able to sort of parlay that knowledge, be able to parlay that sort of influence in a way that circumvents the traditional like art market, which is find yourself a gallerist, participate in the primary market. That ends up on secondary markets, and then that ends up influencing sort of how the prices, fluctuate and actuate and all these things. So with that in mind, it is a democratization of the cultural production side of art and sharing that work, which would traditionally be handled by the gallerist.
Yeah.
You be in a space, you see the artwork, and you see all of the wares that are being offered. Now, it's so the distance between like point A and point B have been radically eliminated. And so we're thinking about that also in terms of the NFT space. And I'm thinking about it in terms of barriers to entry. And this is what ICA has always had we've always put we put a premium on this idea of access, because access is everything. It is what makes an artist feel like an artist. What makes it makes a scholar feel like a scholar, having access to information, to audiences, to artwork, to anything, a cultural experience or whatever. The NFT space is entirely democratizing that process by eliminating those barriers to entry. As long as you have some sort of technological savvy, you have access to a community space that's willing to spend money on your artwork.
Yeah.
And so I think what's really sort of become the challenge is separating the signal from the noise. And this is something that I always talk about, where there's so many things that are occupying our time and vying for our attention that we want to participate in, but the reality is that as humans we just can't. And so really figuring out what is most essential to either whatever our goal is to be it eliminate the barriers to entry, or to participate in the space, or to just have some modicum of cultural cachet. NFTs are doing that splendidly. And so I think the next step is to, with institutions and blue chip gallerists, are to see where their rosters fit in, see how these conversations can be had with the greater community, the ones who are shouting the loudest, and be able to find some common ground between the two. And then I think the process will sort of sort itself out organically.
Yeah, I think it's kind of doing that. Like Barquito is part of this community called Foundation, which is, OpenSea, anybody can post an NFT on OpenSea, but Foundation is more, you have to be invited to.
With Foundation, yeah.
With Foundation as well?
Yeah, I think Holly Hearn did like some work with her partner too. Like they established a DAO through that and everything.
He's on there, and it's like something that's more, it's kind of like putting a barrier on entry on quality. Like you have to be invited. But,
yeah.
Last question, since we're kind of running out of time.
Sure.
It seems like our Basel Miami Beach came roaring back this year. However, as a temporary gallery, in the weeks that followed, COVID killed us because it surged in the neighborhood, and everybody that came to the gallery those days got sick, and it was a pain. But now we're here again, thank God. So I just wanted to ask you, how do you think this is going to affect next year's events, if at all? Like, how is the experiential side of the art world going to adapt to COVID?
Right.
Because it's still kind of all up in the air. Like right before the talk, we took a test, and we were like, what if one of us comes up negative and positive?
Right. That's
the whole talk was the shit.
That's my biggest fear too, being that guy who ends up derailing the entire program just because he got COVID. So, you know, if not to anthropomorphize capitalism, but for as long as like that still has steam, like we're not slowing down. Like, unfortunately, like this new accelerated kind of like framework of like this new accelerated sort of arts ecosystem demands that we be everywhere at once. And so, you know, our Basel, for as long as it can do its OVR, OVR was the online viewing rooms, which was an online component to their otherwise robust programming that they do every year, which, you know, served as an extension to it without replacing it entirely. I feel like some of the implications of COVID will be that OVRs will still exist, that there will still be opportunities to connect virtually, that like a lot of these satellite programs will continue to do live streaming and things that ultimately like put these events and artists still up on the pedestal. I don't see it slowing down, frankly. As long as the transactional aspect of the arts world still exists, which now people who are developing NFTs coincidentally are starting to get a taste of, I think that our Basel will, if not our Basel, there will be something to occupy that space, indefinitely, in perpetuity. I don't see it slowing down. I like to be seen. They like to be out. They like to avoid. You know, they like to see the artwork and they like to talk about it. And they also like to take selfies.
They like to go on there. That's kind of one of the things that I wanted to talk about in the intro. That part of the hierarchy of needs.
Yeah.
After food and shelter, you want to belong to something. Before self-actualization, you want to belong to something. And this is something people want to belong to.
Sure. We talked about Maslow's like hierarchy of needs. And yeah, sure. You know, you can't live off art alone, but it certainly makes art worth living.
Yeah.
So yeah, there is that community aspect to it too, which, you know, to plug ICA a little bit, that's always been a goal of ours. Part of our mission is to go out into the community and connect with individuals and make sure that we are also representing the people who are doing the best in the community. And so I don't see that changing anytime soon because, you know, the way that digitally mediated communication goes, I mean, how many of us have complained about only dealing with emails, right? Like, there will always be this sort of very human desire to sort of want to have face-to-face. And that's why these sort of big art events are so important. And not the ones that are insular in nature, not the ones that only require you do like the walking path and take the photo and do the thing, and then share it with your audiences, which exist behind a screen. But like, the opportunity for people to, and maybe I'm romanticizing this, having, you know, approach the art world from this perspective of somebody who likes art first and needs money first, you know, at the same time. I just think about it as like that desire to connect on that level, that's not going away anytime soon. But the powers that be, the ones who are accelerating capitalism, see this as an opportunity to also be able to like bridge those two divides. And so maybe in the future we'll see a little bit of a hybrid model, you know, augmented reality, XR technologies, those kind of things. Those exist like as a sort of opportunity for people to be in those spaces and connect with each other, right? I see that as being a space worth exploring. And yeah, I think that's a good place to kind of.
Yeah, that's a good place to
Yeah.
Ted, well, thank you everybody for coming. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. And again, I love sharing the knowledge, so if, you know.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for talking with me. It's been great. It helped me with my fear of public speaking as well. So.
My pleasure.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. We're opening the floor to questions. If anybody has a question, comment.
Yeah, so
I have a question.
I have the floor. Yeah, go ahead.
So before social media was crazy, or like gave all like the leverage or the power to the actual artists or creative, the institutions, or if it was music, the promoters or whatever, always had, you know, like the tagline, but you'll get a lot of exposure.
Oh yeah.
You know?
Sure. Yeah.
So is there a current, like right now, social, like exposure is at our fingertips, you know? Is there a new version of like leverage or like, and or like tagline that the institutions are using in order to be able to get lower rates or like more quality or?
Well, you know, we're living in a time when like social capital is something that's broadcasted to the general to the world.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so one of these things that we're noticing is that there's a lot of blowback on people who, well, first of all, coming from those music spaces, let me just touch on this briefly. Because the idea of playing for exposure is a predatory practice. Right?
100%.
Because really we talk about art and labor, and the two are inextricably entwined. So the labor that goes into creating the artwork, which ends up, you know, enriching the gallerists, who ends up creating the experience for the audiences, that starts somewhere. It starts with the artist, and so the artist the artist requires compensation for that, and that's something that I think has always been a part of my administrative practice, as well as something that we do very well at ICA. I pick up on little strains of institutions vying from that sort of practice, wherein like all of the artists deserve to be paid or paid up front and these kind of things. But we don't really condone, taking those kind of predatory practices into the art world space. I think, if you've already established yourself as somebody who's going to be showing an exhibition, you know, as a solo artist for the first time in a museum, which is what we like to do, then you deserve to be compensated for it.
Right.
Yeah. So again, that level of gradation, it exists, and it's something that I think as artists should be aware of and reject whenever they see it. And that's the beauty of social media too. And so thank you for this question, because this is so kind of a new line of like thinking. And I think that's kind of the beauty, right? Like as artists, no one wants to feel taken advantage of. No one wants to pay for play. Nobody wants to, work for exposure. That is an outmoded way of operating. And so I think like now, we're seeing activism, and I come from an activist space too. So we touch very briefly on NFTs and their environmental impact, but I come from an activist space. And one of my things that I love seeing online is I love seeing these institutions being held to task. And this comes from somebody who's also a part of the institutional space, right? I love seeing institutions like the Whitney be held accountable for doing X, Y, and Z. It only makes them better institutions in the long run. Having known exactly what it is they're doing that is affecting the arts community in detrimental ways. And so, that is, for me, also another dimension of how social media is fulfilling the promise of opening up ease of access to individuals. It's making them aware of some of these issues that exist in art spaces, which is, art for or like labor for exposure and pay for play and all these different types of like outmoded ways of creating art and participating in these worlds. You can read about it, And there's social media feeds that are dedicated toward exposing it. And I find that to be such an interesting way for activism to find its way into the social space.
Yeah, and it happens a lot in the gallery world. Like, I've heard of a lot of artists, emerging artists from different countries, that they want to have participation in a gallery in New York, for example. But the gallery in New York won't pay for the shipping. They say, okay, if you send us the work, we might show it, or we'll show it. But then the work stays in New York. Oh, it didn't sell. You're gonna have to pay for the shipping back. And it was something that really stuck with me. And all the artists that we're working with in this show, I say, like, no way. We'll pay for the shipping. We'll take care of it. You just give us the work and we'll handle it, because that's the role of the gallery.
Yeah.
It's not like I'm just going to provide the space, and if it doesn't work, no, there's more. You have to do more. The guy creates, or the woman creates the work, and you make sure to show it and give them the exposure. But it's very predatory. Like, it exists in all levels, and it's something that we're trying to change here.
Yeah, yeah. And without getting into too many details, like anecdotally, there's a lot of gallerists I've heard. Part of the reason why they take artists into their space in the first part is to just exploit their contacts.
That's true.
And so I think about that sort of thing too, and it's we're talking for commercial spaces too. In institutions, this is a little bit different, right? We have honorariums. We budget for these sort of things. But in the commercial spaces, it's a little bit more like touch and go,
Yeah.
And so I think the opportunity kind of presents itself more purely of the way it's structured, right? It's handled more like a business than an institution.
Definitely.
Even though like the new model is, even the most conservative museums oftentimes charge people admission, which also ICA kind of sees as a relic of the past.
Yeah.
We want to be able to we want to be able to provide free and open access to the most innovative art of our time, and we want to be able to do it wherever you're experiencing contemporary art, be it your cell phone or in person, just wandering around the Miami Design District.
Yeah.
So again, the whole ecosystem is it's built so that the artist, at least within the institutional space, the artist gets paid, the artist contributes to the overall authority of the institution, and that's sort of the transactional value between the artist and the institution. And then from the consumer's standpoint, that individual's expectations are either met or they're met or they leave disappointed, because it's either what they expected or they didn't. So yeah. Yes.
So I wanted to ask about what you think about the effect of these massive arts events on the local population in the city that may occur in. So, for instance, in Miami, we have argued that the biggest of these events of all are held in Miami Beach, and it completely takes over the city for a week. And overall, I think that if you live here, you become quite cynical towards puzzle and art in general, because it just turns art into this new spectacle, this sort of tourist event that you have to deal with when you work in really any industry. And so I'm wondering, what do you think can be done to maybe counter that or accommodate it, or maybe create a more positive, more sustainable engagement with the art world that's not predicated on, for instance, this sort of hyperactive market mentality that comes with puzzle?
Well, that's a great question. And I think that a lot of it comes from community spaces. I've had a lot of engagement in these kind of community spaces through work with a local venue that we did called 229. I think, unfortunately, like money talks. So whenever these kind of blockbuster events move into spaces, they end up kind of chewing up a lot of the scenery in terms of the share of voice, which is how we message the thing. So people don't talk about art season like art season. They talk about it as Art Basel Miami Beach is in town. right? And so I think part of it is redirecting the narrative to be more about the community spaces that help make these things happen in the first place. The artists that, and I think there's examples too of this sort of thing happening, but I think it's also to our geographic detriment that, and this happens in music too, that the dialogue that goes on between the arts communities, right, it suffers as a result. And so what we end up seeing is that when Art Basel moves into town, we have a lot of people from New York, LA, Chicago, overseas, like into town, and we open up that discourse amongst each other to be able to like create a space where that art can kind of move out, right? The Miami art scene, be it an insular thing, could expand, and that programming can be distributed across like multiple months as opposed to multiple weeks, right? And so I think to answer your question, as far as Art Basel goes, Art Basel is not going anywhere, and there will always be a glut of people looking to rush to capitalize on the energy that goes on around it. But what I think the burden is placed on the arts communities to sustain that momentum and to be able to create those spaces where that dialogue can extend in perpetuity. And I think that rests on both the artists, the institutions, and that's something that ICA has been really working on very deeply in creating those community spaces where, like, you know, we can offer rigorous arts research programs. We can create, and we have, you know, our First Fridays programs that attracts a lot of artists who end up talking amongst each other. And I think that what ends up happening as a result of all of that, the exchange of art and ideas, are events. This desire to connect. And so I think more institutions need to kind of pick up they need to carry the torch beyond Art Basel and be able to parlay a lot of that energy into community-driven events, community-driven work that needs to happen amongst the art spaces. So I hope that answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great.
All right, I think we have time
Thank you
for
very
one
much.
more.
Thanks.
One more question.
Anyone else? Well, thank you so much. And if anyone would like to talk afterward, I'll be around for another hour or so, and I really look forward to meeting you all. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. Thank you.